Thank you. Our next speaker is Richard Falk, and Brother Ahmad has already mentioned his contribution. I'll just add one point. In the late 1960s, when Vietnam War was going on, in the television debates, the State Department was represented by father of a good friend of mine to defend the government position on Vietnam. And it was at this time that Richard Falk, as a young intellectual, professor of law, Princeton University, was arguing that it was wrong on the part of the United States to involve in Vietnam. So with this, I invite Richard Falk to present his ideas. Thank you.
Greetings to everyone, and we are extremely appreciative of the fact that so many of those we wish to be here are here. We had very little time to organize the event, and we felt that it was more important to act with a sense of urgency than it was to be careful about the planning and logistics. And I hope that was a correct decision. Both Ahmed and Jeremy gave very important talks. I intended to say more, but I will try to be brief so as not to encumber the program to any greater extent. We have a full day of presentations, and we hope to have a very participatory set of interactions. The whole inspiration for this gathering, I think, was our belief that it's not enough at this stage for those in civil society to be critical of what our governments and institutions are doing. It's a time for action, and it's a time to go beyond words and to figure out what leverage can be brought to bear to bring this horrible train of events to as quick an end as possible. Of course, the planning of the conference for today, as has been pointed out, benefited from the fact that the International Court of Justice issued its ruling yesterday. If it had been tomorrow, it would have probably hardly merited discussion, maybe some anticipation. And it is, in my view, the most historic moment in the history of the International Court of Justice, going back to the end of World War II. It is the time when international law triumphed, ever so briefly probably, over the primacy of geopolitics. And the size of the majority in the court is as impressive as the substance of the rulings. And I think was a big surprise. I was particularly struck by an American State Department bureaucrat who honored her pledge to be politically independent and act as a jurist, not as a representative of a government in reaching the conclusion and happening to be the president of the court at this time. So it's, if nothing else, it is a moment of celebration for the importance, symbolically and hopefully substantively. The hopefully substantively, I think, depends on the activism of civil society, on the activism of people gathered in this room and others throughout the world. Because I think it would be unlikely that Israel will do more than try to deflect any kind of assessment of its behavior, either by direct repudiation or by its behavior. So once one has these rulings that are very important and has been pointed out, transcend the issue of whether or not a ceasefire was mentioned in the course of the rulings. It was not requested by South Africa, and it may have, the avoidance of it in the ruling may have accounted for the size of the majority vote. In other words, it might have been an internal political compromise that allowed this extraordinary consensus to emerge, which gives this set of rulings much more authority than if it had been an 8-7 or 9-6 outcome. And so I think that's one very important element. It also exposes the political corruption of the governments that support Israel, who have put themselves before the world as the greatest exponents of liberalism in terms of law and institutional arrangements. And it is a shocking thing, if we think about it, shocking and shameful, that these liberal governments are perhaps the first instances of so-called democracies lending support openly to an ongoing genocide that is visible to the eyes and ears of the entire world. I can think of no real precedent for that kind of behavior. And it's not only that they watched it without doing anything, they actually enabled it. And there are crimes of complicity that should be addressed and were not by the outcome in the International Court of Justice, partly because the South African request did not directly focus on it. But with the rulings, any conscientious reading of the convention imposes on all parties a clear duty to take whatever action is necessary and possible to prevent genocide. And having established that the behavior of Israel is genocidal, the continued support for Israel in diplomatic, intelligence, material, weaponry would be it seems to me, itself a crime under the Genocide Convention. So even if, as I think is probable, there will be what I call a crisis of implementation. In other words, the court has spoken, but whether its words will translate into action remains to be seen, and based on what the highest officials in the US and Israel have said, it seems highly unlikely that they will in good faith comply with the substance and spirit of the ICJ rulings. The genocidal nature of what has been happening since October 7th, it is, for 4 reasons, a very original form of genocide. And the first of these reasons are that it is, as far as I know, the most transparent genocide ever, bringing the imagery of atrocity to the eyes and ears of people all over the world on a daily basis, and therefore stimulating this outpouring of outrage that has led to what Jeremy referred to as this unique experience of demonstrations everywhere, and even throughout the countries whose governments are supporting Israel. And it has shown the gap between how special interests distort governments that are supposed to reflect the values and preferences of their citizenries. In almost all of these countries, the public doesn't follow what the government is, what it has, the kind of policies that it has pursued out of essentially geopolitical, and I would say hidden racist affinities. One takes note of the fact that not one of the supporters of the South African initiative comes from the global West. Either the settler colonial countries of North America or Australia, New Zealand, or the former colonial European powers. And that all of the support for the Palestinian struggle comes from the global South, the explicit support on a governmental level. And I think that kind of divide is leading to a challenge that makes this struggle in Gaza and the suffering associated with that struggle not only significant in terms of its human consequences, but it also means the end of the post-Cold War period and the beginning of something new. What that something new will be depends on whether a wider war emerges and how this one ends, how this struggle ends. In addition to this transparency made evident through TV and brave journalists who report daily, there's never before been such a intensity of devastation and killing in a short period of time that is explicitly part of the policy agenda of the perpetrators. This is, in my mind, something new. And if you adjust the missing and killed, without even including those that are seriously injured, if you adjust for demography, this would be the equivalent of 5 to 6 million people killed in the United States, or double that number if the whole of the European Union was included. In other words, it has a magnitude that proportional to the population that should at least shock the conscience of mankind. And as I mentioned, this endorsement of such a series of events by the liberal leadership of the world, the liberal governmental leadership of the world, is something also that is unique to this series of events. And I think the final thing I would mention is that never before has a security self-defense rationale been so brazenly embraced as a justification for ethnic cleansing. In other words, security is the cover story, but the real motivations that could be seen by the policies of pre-October 7th that were pursued by the Netanyahu government and were hailed as the most extreme Israeli government ever to take power. And what made it extreme was precisely what's happening in both Gaza and the West Bank. And that, if you couple that with the fact that Israel had a year's warning about this probable Hamas attack, plus the incredibly uncharacteristic lapse of a security response, it seems evident that at the very least, Israel used this as a pretext and probably had some notion that this was something that would occur and needed to occur to give them a political foundation for carrying out what amounts to a second Nakba. As I said, our program aims mainly at trying to explore what can be done. And we'll have much more opportunity to do this in the course of the day. I think the two things that I would just highlight and hopefully we can discuss, first is the formation of a people's tribunal that would examine this whole course of events, modeled on the Russell Tribunal or its successor, the Permanent People's Tribunal in Rome. And the second thing is the reform of the UN to empower the General Assembly as a way of circumventing the veto. I think that would have an enormous effect on stimulating an organization that was interested in the views of people and not a medium for special interests and governmental commitments to national interests. So I'm very glad, as I've said, that we are gathered here, and I thank you all for being here. Let me start. This last session has been very stimulating to me and makes me understand why it was so important to supplement the declaration that started this process with a gathering of this sort that is a sharing of insights and passions and visions of what needs to be done and how to do it. And that's, it's very rare that you find an intellectual and political atmosphere that is so dedicated to doing the right thing. And I'm very moved by this day-long conference. And I wanted to just make a couple of comments that flow from what was said, because I think it's extremely important that we understand that Israel's recourse to genocide is partly a culmination of their apartheid structure. When apartheid fails to achieve the objectives of the dominant colonial presence, the only thing left to it is either to give up the project or to forcibly displace the native people. And you have that rhythm and pattern wherever settler colonialism either succeeds or fails. And this genocidal phase, the resistance to it will bring a Zionist Israel to an end. And so the stakes are very high, in my view. You cannot have a Jewish supremacy state that does not it does not rest on some kind of logic of dehumanization that is structured around apartheid, and when apartheid isn't sufficient to achieve the goals of the dominant society, then genocide is the sequel. So if one wants to never think, to make genocide unthinkable, one has to make also apartheid unthinkable. Because as soon as you divide people in ways that rest on conceptions of superiority and inferiority, or the whole myth that Palestine was the early Zionist myth that Palestine was a land without people for a people without land. That you saw the roots of this, the deep historical roots of what has transpired being unconsciously professed from the earliest period, the pre-Hitler, pre-Nazi period. So it's not even, the Holocaust is not the deepest roots of this way of transfiguring a country and its native people into something that serves a settler colonial project. When we started this idea of having a conference, we also thought that it was important to think about what could be done. And we've said, I think, extremely practical, useful things throughout the day. And they basically involve commitments of citizen engagement on behalf of pressure on governments, on international institutions, wherever we find our situation creates a potential for leverage. And building on what Penny has said, we now know that the responsibility and the opportunity rest squarely on the peoples of the world. If we have the benefit of the kind of policy tools that the ICJ provided in order to allow people to mobilize in effective ways. But we know that there will not be an automatic implementation of what the South African initiative was trying to achieve. That implementation crisis will only be resolved by popular, effective presence of a much greater magnitude than anything we've seen so far. In other words, the condition, the balance of forces is still not favorable to ending this genocidal assault. And the worst could yet be to come if you consider that 80% of the population is vulnerable to starvation and housing has been completely destroyed in Gaza. So the urgency of working in various ways to create the kind of atmosphere that produces a ceasefire in Gaza is essential. And that, as I say, the political will does not exist among the relevant governments to implement what the International Court of Justice decreed. That's the sad, tragic fact of life. In trying to think of a undertaking that only segments of civil society could initiate, I've been drawn to the idea of forming a people's tribunal to assess the criminality, but especially the criminality that we've been talking about is the easy part, but the hard part is the criminality of complicity, which goes to the structures that allow genocide and these behavioral patterns to occur. And one of the sort of shocking things that's evident from the Rohingya experience is that even with the issuance of the provisional orders, it takes the International Tribunal 4 years. 4 years in not a rescue of the people that are subject to this extreme abuse, these extreme patterns of abuse. And the advantage of a People's Tribunal is that it can operate within a very short period of time. It is not subject to the same political pressures that led to, I'm almost sure, some compromises among the judges to reach a consensus, a majoritarian consensus, which is very important. So one can assemble an objective account of what's happening with moral authority figures forming a jury of conscience, in effect, not a strictly legal, it doesn't try to compete with formal legal institutions. But the past record of, starting with the Russell Foundation, which was dismissed at the time, it compiled the most impressive objective record of the abuses committed during the Vietnam War. And the same was true with the Istanbul Iraq War Tribunal in 2005, where leading jurists and leading moral authority figures came together to produce a really impressive set of results that I think at the time exerted some influence on attitudes toward the responsibility of corporations and governments toward the people of Iraq. And I think that this situation and its broad implications does lend itself to a tribunal that, if it can be organized and funded, can have an extraordinary impact, because unlike other situations, the whole world is mobilized around these issues. And it would be possible to have sessions of the tribunal in different regions of the world, and it might really make a lasting impact on this whole struggle to create human unity, which is the underpinning of an anti-genocidal global atmosphere. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. Inspiring as ever.